Now, I touched on this yesterday, how the madness of identity politics has infected the Labor Party's budget response. I noted this bizarre critique that somehow the budget is anti-women, as if women aren't taxpayers, as if women aren't workers, as if women aren't unemployed, or as if women don't own their own businesses and so on. The critique itself and what people demand of the budget is itself sexist, saying that it needs some special gender-based policies, I think. It's silly. And what it really shows is that this budget is so generous, it provides so little scope for criticism from the left, that all they've got left is lame identity politics. Have a look at this.
This is a budget that managed to rack up more than $1 trillion in debt and still managed to leave Australian women behind. Nothing for childcare, nothing for workforce participation.
Nothing for childcare? Jim Chalmers has a strange definition of nothing. There was $9 billion for childcare, a record spend on childcare, but the Shadow Treasurer calls that nothing. And nothing for workforce participation. There's a $1 billion job subsidy scheme on top of all the tax measures and infrastructure spending aimed at boosting jobs. This does nothing for workforce participation. Little wonder Chalmers still won't join us for an interview. But what about this, a staged and rehearsed effort from Christina Keneally?
Scott Morrison delivered his budget. $1 trillion in debt and nothing for women. Nothing for people over 35. They have been left behind in Scott Morrison's budget. Right here, black and white. Women over 35s ignored in budget. How can we be leaving women behind during the Morrison recession? I mean, Scott Morrison spent more time over the weekend picking out women's names for his chickens than he did putting policies in his budget to help actual Australian women.
Actual Australian women. There is nothing for women in this budget. Tax cuts don't go to women. Job subsidies don't help women. Small business tax breaks don't help women who are running small businesses or women working in those businesses. Additional welfare payments, they don't go to women. Economic survival isn't about women. Infrastructure spending doesn't help women. What is this? Christina Keneally spent more time coming up with this pathetic Twitter-level attack than she did reading the budget or learning about economics. That looks like a surrender to me, Labor surrendering on the economic debate. All they've got left is Twitter and identity politics. How demeaning it is for women for Labor to ignore all the crucial policy and economic questions and instead say that what women really needed was some glossy special section with lots of cliches and platitudes about women, gender and identity politics. Yep, Christina, I'm sure that's what women want. Let's go to Labor Senator for New South Wales now, Deb O'Neill, who joins us from Canberra. Thanks for joining us, Deb. Surely Christina Keneally can do better than that.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Chris, and to see your viewers, and the men and the women out there who are, vitally interested in what happened this week in terms of the budget that we're going to see roll out across the country over the next 4 years. And if everything goes right, we'll end up with $1 trillion of debt. So it's a pretty important time for everybody to be paying attention to what's going on, that's for sure.
It is a sobering time indeed. So don't you think your colleague Christina Keneally needs to do better than saying there's nothing in this for women, pointing to a newspaper headline?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I listened to your commentary just before we kicked off, and it sounded like you were actually very similar to some of the comments by Senator Rennick in the chamber today. But the reality is the government did decide they needed to do something specific for women. Somebody must have said to them at some point of time, hey, look, we actually have a very big problem in terms of the numbers of women who are becoming unemployed. It is a bigger problem amongst women than it is amongst men. That's just a matter of fact. There's plenty of stats around that prove that. So given that, they've thought, oh, well, we should do something. So they've done this small signature policy, which is $240 million. That is not a large amount of money to invest in programs that they decided they should put forward for women. $240 million, and I think you had Georgie Dent on yesterday, and she just identified that it was spread so far across so many different jobs that they wanted the money to do. Cadetships and apprenticeships for some women in science, job creation and entrepreneurialism and women's safety at work and at home. $240 million to do all of that for women just, I think, shows you that this government doesn't actually really understand how bad this Morrison recession is for the women of Australia, what the stats are really showing. They haven't really got their policy temperament right with regard to women-specific policies, because if that's it, Chris, I don't think they got their targeting right.
I'll come back to some of those measures in a moment, but just for the third time, can I ask you, shouldn't your colleague Christina Keneally be able to do better than stand up in some fake video on Twitter pointing at a newspaper headline saying that the budget doesn't do anything for women?
Look, I think the newspaper headline speaks for itself, doesn't it, Chris? I mean, it did make the front page. You're a journalist. You've seen plenty of them, and if it makes the front page, it's an issue.
Right. All right. Well, no praise or criticism for your colleague Christina Keneally there. The point here is, though, Deb O'Neill, there's tax cuts there. There's massive spending in infrastructure. There are job subsidies. All of this stuff is gender indiscriminate. All of this stuff applies whether people are male or female. Surely we don't need a whole range of gender-specific budget measures. If so, what are they supposed to be?
Well, we have to respond to the actual realities that confront us as Australians. If there are issues with young people that are markedly different to other parts of the community, then they need a specific response. If there are issues with women that are markedly different to the rest of the population, we need a specific response to that.
Well, let's jump in there. Let's jump in there. With these job subsidies, there is a specific incentive. There is a greater job subsidy for young people younger than 35. Are you saying there should be a bigger subsidy for jobs for women?
Look, I think that the reality of how many women are unemployed, at its peak we saw 1 million Australian women unemployed, and they are going to be very likely ending up on the job seeker payment. You know, I've taken evidence, and I reported in the Senate this afternoon about women who were on it was, called it was called New Start then, but now it's going to be the job seeker payment. And it's part of the mix that we saw in Australian politics that's led to this incredible homelessness amongst women over 55.
All right, so that's great. You say there's a special case for women, special problems for women. Everything's worse for women. Then should there be additional subsidies?
Not everything, Chris.
Right, well,
not everything.
Some of these employment aspects. Should there be an additional? Should employment subsidies for women be higher than for men, as they are for young people?
I think that the policy has to meet the real problems that Australians face. And we know that Australians in business were facing a very big problem before we got to even Christmas. You know, in those olden days when we used to do things completely differently. In the lead up to Christmas, from August, Labor was calling on this government to bring on the stage 2 tax cuts.
I agree. That's a different issue. That's a different issue. You're right.
He did that. That's great.
You're right. Labor backed in bringing forward those tax cuts. The government's done that, and Labor's supporting that. That's all very good,
absolutely.
and that's going to help a lot of men and a lot of women.
And women.
But you were saying,
I agree with you, Chris.
but you were criticising the budget for not doing enough specifically for women. Now, I've cited this example of job subsidies where there is a bigger subsidy, an increased incentive to employ young people. Would Labor argue that there should be an increased subsidy to employ women?
Look, Labor would argue in response to the facts that emerge. And the reality is, yes, there is a very big problem for young Australians and they need a response. The government's shaped the response that they think is appropriate. I hope, with all the benefit of government, with all of the resources at their disposal, that they've looked at the evidence carefully enough, and what they've crafted in this $1 trillion debt that's coming down the line for Australians is the right response to the problems that are confronting that age group to age 30 and 35. But I do worry, given the fact that we do know that there is a disproportionate burden of unemployment being shown amongst Australian women, that the government has decided They're going to put $240 million into a women's project that doesn't look like it's really going to address the scale of that need.
Apart from all the other general measures, there's $240 million specifically for these gender-related issues. It blows my mind how much focus there is on gender issues in this budget. Do you think perhaps we should have a women's budget on Monday nights and then the men's budget on Tuesday nights, have separate budgets for the genders?
Of course not, Chris. You know, I
that would be too silly, wouldn't it?
We are all in it together, you know.
Hooray!
Husbands and wives, mums
Men
and
and
dads,
women.
fathers and sons. You know, I'm a wonderful, happily married woman of 35 years with 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy. I want all of my children to succeed, and I want them to be in Australia that is going to be able to manage the debt that's coming down the line. I want all of them to get the assistance that they need if and when they need that assistance. And I want the programs that are designed to be enabled to support them if that's required. I want them to be based on evidence and facts.
There we go, Deb O'Neill. Appreciate you.
We've got to trust this government a lot. We've got to trust them a lot. You know, so far we've done pretty well as a nation, and we've had a genuinely bipartisan attempt at managing this incredible pandemic. I just hope that Scott Morrison has actually got the facts right, and that the policies that he's advancing and the budget that he's set up for Australia really does meet our needs as a nation, because we're all going to be paying back $1 trillion. I hope he's got it right.
Yeah, spot on. Thanks for joining us, Deb. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Deb O'Neill there, a Labor senator. Mixed gender families with aspirations for all of them, as it should be. Not that there's anything wrong with the alternative, but men and women, we all want to see all of them succeed.